When it comes to paints for miniatures, never before did we have as many paint ranges available as today, and never before has it been so difficult to choose which one to get. How do you know which is the best one? What if you drop hundreds of dollars on a paint range and you don't like it? What if there's a better one out there that can do more? Never has there been more FOMO around the product that is essential to miniature painting. So I made this video to share my perspective and to provide you with a strategy that will help you stop wasting money on new paints. Chances are you already own more than you need. Hell, everyone talks about their miniature pile of shame, but how many of you have a pile of shame like this? If we ask experienced miniature painters about which paints to get, 9 out of 10 will tell you the same strategy. And it's mind-blowing how simple it is and how much sense it makes, and ultimately how much money it can save you. So let's look at the paint ranges that I use the most and my reasons for using them, and also give you some examples for paints that I supplement these core ranges with and why, so you can understand my approach through a few practical examples. And hopefully it will help you realize that you do not have to FOMO over every new paint release. So here's a quick overview of my collection. I own lots and lots of paint pots, and I have massive regrets about some of them. I also own a couple of artist grade colors and oils, but a while ago I realized something, and I put a lot of these away and focused on a tight core of paints, most of which you can see behind me. And even these are probably too much, because just like everyone, I have my go-to colors, and I use some of these a lot more than others, whether that's because I like turquoise better than red or because I work with universal highlight colors a lot. And what I realized was that I have a particular style of painting that I enjoy, and no potentially slight improvement in results justifies the investment of money. That is buying a new paint range, especially if the paint range has different properties or using it means a totally new approach to painting. What you can see here is that the bulk of my paints is made up from AK Interactive and Vallejo Game Color paints, and this is my core set of paints. These are the ones I use for 90% of painting. They all behave very similar, and I can just swap them in and out as I need them without having to adjust anything. AK has more of these muted colors, and Game Color has a few more intense colors, more chromatic and vivid across the whole range. And that doesn't mean that AK does not have these, but since I have Game Color equivalents already, I don't need them from AK. Yet I also really like these pastel mixes that AK has that I cannot find in Game Color, for example, and the orange and red tones are super intense. So what you realize, hopefully, is that I do not own any range completely, and that's because they complement each other. And if I already have a very similar color, I don't need to buy it from another range. Also, over the years, I have figured out what my preferences are and what colors I like to work with and what I can use them for and which I can leave out because I would never use them. Now, I don't expect the new painter to know all of that, but that's where my system of buying paints only if I see a need comes in. Bear with me. The third range that you can find a lot in the paints that I work with is Citadel colors. And that's mainly because there is some iconic paints in there like Nurgling Green or Celestra Gray. Squig Orange in particular is something that I could not find in any other range as a premix color. So one of the reasons why you want to add a color to your collection could be that it is convenient to have the color as a premix pot and readily available whenever you need it. So what is the strategy to buying paints that I mentioned earlier? Can you already tell? I'll spell it out for you just in case. Just build a core of paints that you need for the armies or type of minis you are painting right now, and only make your collection larger as an actual need arises. This can be as simple as wanting to paint a new army, a new scheme with new details. Maybe you want to make some glowing things, then fluorescent paints will be better at that than any other acrylic paints. Do you want to make your results more intense? Then you will have to probably get some inks or artist grade paints to mix in with your regular range. This red is a little prettier than this one, or it has 3.9% more pigment, is usually not something that will solve any of your problems as a painter. The only thing it will do is make your wallet lighter. The reality is most of what is sold today in the miniature painting segment is very solid colors. They can't afford to put out crappy colors anymore because there's too many great sets around these days that are already really high standard. And there's a reason why Army Painter redid their original set. So the differences are very small, and I do not recommend getting 2 or 3 sets of paints that basically all do the same thing. The good thing is though that them all having very similar properties also means you can mix and match them to gradually build your perfect core range. So now I hear you ask how to decide what your core range should be. My recommendation is to try a few colors from each of these ranges and then decide. Get some blues from Pro Acryl, some reds from AK Interactive, get some turquoise from Vallejo Game Color, add some odd skin tones from Citadel, the new Army Painter range, and to lesser extent Scale 75 maybe. All of these ranges are good for beginners and advanced painters alike. And while you are able to try out all of these colors, you already built a solid stock of core colors. Oh, and I'll get to why I think Scale 75 is a bit of an exception to this rule later in the video. Hi, Chris from the future here. Halfway into filming, I saw that John released a very similar video to this one, and I was going to do this PSA just to get ahead of the very tiny amount of hate watchers I have that would tell me I just ripped off his idea, because no one has ever done a similar video to this before. But after watching his video, I actually think it is great timing because it just illustrates the idea of this video, that we all are different and it is almost useless to recommend paints, or at least to call one range the best one ever, as all of it is subjective to a certain extent and we all have different experiences and different preferences when it comes to painting. The third range that you can find a lot in the paints that I work with is Citadel colors.
They're like a C, maybe C+ quality paint range. And the final range not in danger of the chopping block today are begrudgingly the Games Workshop contrast paints. They just have a spot here because they do something that standard miniature paints don't do.
And I also use contrast paints a lot. Not in the intended way. I don't think I ever used them in the intended way at all.
Chimera is going to leave my shelves. Now this stuff, guess what? Their quality control is garbage.
Chimera colors are amazing. They are great for mixing, and when I want high pigment load and intense colors, they're perfect. You get the idea. The differences in these ranges that I mentioned, and most of these that I did not mention, are so small, I'm not going to recommend any range as the perfect one. So I'd rather give some general advice what to look at when considering what paints you want to try out to pick for your core range. First of all, you should look at whether or not you like the available colors. Do you like more muted colors or flashier ones? Some ranges have one or the other, and some just have both. How are the physical properties? Some Reaper paints, for example, I would really like to use just don't come off of the brush easily. They feel dusty and dry very quickly. They just don't have a great flow, unlike the game colors, for example. And I just don't want to put up with that. Next, I would check how they behave on your preferred palette. Some paints break faster than others on a wet palette, for example. When using the paint, do you feel like you have to fight it? Does it do what you want it to do? Or does any step in the painting process feel inconvenient? Another thing to consider is what finish are you looking for? The reason why I'm using AK Interactive and Game Color, for example, other than the available tones, is that their finish is matte. And I like to be in control of where my highlights go, which isn't that easy when using satin colors, as they reflect light, and I just don't like that. Yet I do use some Citadel paints, simply for the fact that I like the colors. And I also use contrast paints a lot. Not in the intended way. I don't think I ever used them in the intended way at all. But I have found a great use for them, even though they dry glossy. That's why I have AK Ultramatte varnish in my batch of paints to knock the shine off from my finished models when I need to. That's just a side note, but you get where I'm going with this. So what other paints do I use as an auxiliary addition to my core? Before we get to that, a quick word from this video's sponsor. Into the AM produces some of the best graphic tees on the internet. They have hundreds of designs available and I am obsessed with them. Just look at how many of these shirts I own. If you watch my videos regularly, you can see me wear some of my favorite designs, even in videos that are not sponsored, just because they feel so amazing to wear. They're adding new designs each week. Just look at these new arrivals, each of them a design masterpiece. Right now you can grab a custom pack of graphic shirts for only $61.95, and if you're using my code or the link in the description, you can get an extra 10% off of your order. And you're supporting the channel in the process. I personally also love their basic line. It has become part of my daily wardrobe. Heck, I'm barely wearing anything else anymore. Check out their new spring collection with the new button-up shirts. I have some of these on the way and I can't wait to wear them during summer. So what are you waiting for? Elevate your everyday apparel and grab some of the most unique graphic tees on the internet to instantly add an inch to your biceps. And don't forget to use my link to grab that extra 10% discount. I just talked about contrast paints, and that doesn't come as a surprise really to regular viewers of the channel, since I have tons of videos how I use them. Not only are they great washes, better than most dedicated washes that are around today actually, I also like to add them to regular acrylics when I want to give them more punch, more intensity. I also like to use them over pre-shading, simply because instead of covering areas, they mostly stain them, even when applying 4 or 5 layers. I also like to shade metallics with them because the variety of tones just works really well for a wide range of magic weapon effects or different styles of armor and gear in varying styles of decay, for example. Another important tool in my arsenal is inks, and some of their uses are really similar to how I use contrast paints. Whenever I'm trying to go for really intense colors, I just mix them in with my regular acrylics. They're great for staining gradients, shading metallics, and on top of that, their pigment density is very high. White and black ink are perfect for pre-shading without a lot of speckling, and white ink also helps with putting that punchy white highlight down without much trouble. Inks also have great flow. They creep into recesses really nicely, which helps with pin washing or when I want to make sure that the paint stays in the recesses. Like here, the white on this glow effect. I would like to include fluor paints into this conversation because they're a little obsession of mine and a good example how chasing the perfect paint can lead to a lot of wasted money. You can see that I own lots of different brands up here, and lately I also added this set of inks because they work better through the airbrush. And was it worth it to spend all this time on researching the properties, buying all the different versions and trying them out? I guess it's again a case of whether or not you have a particular result in mind. I don't own a single pot of regular Green Stuff World paint, but this fluor paint just does exactly what I want and it makes me happy. Something I can't say about any of the other available red fluor paints. So did I go a little crazy here? No doubt about it. But to me, it was worth it. So as your experience grows, you will most likely replace some of your paints, but make sure it is because they do not work for what you want to do with them, and not because there's a new range that is the new hot shit. Chimera colors are amazing, in my opinion. The signature sets have some weaknesses when it comes to quality, but I had no problems with the single pigment set. They are great for mixing, and when I want high pigment load and intense colors, they're perfect. And the plus is that they also behave very similar to regular acrylics, unlike some other heavy body paints that you can use for similar results. And obviously when you want to mix a lot. Downside of these is that there are limited colors available. It's just the primaries and a few additional ones. And you kind of have to be confident with mixing your own tones. Vallejo metals are also on my paint racks, and I've never looked back ever since I started using them. Funny enough, before that I was using scale 75 metallics. These are the only ones I found so far that come close to the Vallejo Air, simply because they almost cover in one pass, and on top of that they're so thin you can add very diluted highlight layers, bringing back some shine without any grainy results. Oddly, there is no gold in the Vallejo metal airbrush color range, or at least none that is good, but I do use a different approach for that anyway. I own a very small amount of paints that have a very confined use, like this Tamiya white for example, that I use to establish pre-shading. Especially when used with the Tamiya thinner, it gives these really smooth transitions almost without any speckling, which means the transitions will be super fine. Obviously, this is a singular use case. You don't quite need that level of investment. If you simply want to do a zenithal priming, you can do that with Replicants, for example. Hiding in here is my very small stash of oil paints. And when we look through them, you can see that they are of a very narrow color palette. I used to have a lot of oil paints because I chased the smooth result that they promise. But again, very similar to artist acrylics, I did not like the workflow. But these oils are just so great for pin washing because they just run into recesses and the capillary effect pulls them along. And if you create a mess, you can just easily clean them off of the raised surfaces with a makeup sponge. Now these colors need a thinner, obviously, and the workflow is again different from using regular acrylics. But this is a case where I actually don't mind because it's simple to use and very effective. So this is an example where I picked up a tool to put into my arsenal because I needed something that creates very thin dark lining very quickly. So this was absolutely worth the investment, even though I do not use oil paints a lot. However, if I want to paint an army of Space Marines, this will be my weapon of choice, simply for the result it creates and how quick it is. And this leads us to a few paint ranges that I own, but that I dropped from my roster over the years, or that I never really got into. And I'll talk about my reasons for that, because I think understanding why that is gives some further insight into the topic. My experience with the Scale 75 paint range tells us a lot about how important it is to have a core range of paints that is consistent over all colors, and why this range is not really a good choice for beginners in my opinion. And those of you that are around since the beginning of the channel know that I was really happy with Scale 75 paints at first. They were one of the few paints back then that were matte. But when I painted my red grip charger, I thought I had completely forgotten how to paint. I could just not make these reds work. And it literally made me question whether or not I lost my skills during the break. They were not opaque and they lacked intensity even after applying 5 or 6 layers. Now, most of the other colors were fine, but that was a massive deal breaker. I do not want to deal with inconsistencies in paints. I need the blues of a range to behave in a similar way as the greens and the reds without having to change my workflow around and without implementing workarounds. Now, if the rest of the range is fine, why do I not recommend Scale 75 for beginners? The problem is that scale colors have a different acrylic medium. It has a more gel-like consistency and it takes a while to get used to how this medium behaves. Now, when you are switching to any of the other paints that have a more fluid medium, what happens is you have to relearn how they behave. Something that doesn't happen when you switch from Pro Acryl to AK, for example. And that might sound like a minor thing, but I wouldn't underestimate that as a source of frustration for newer painters when you have scale color paints and you need to supplement the reds, and then you have to relearn how to thin them and how they come off of the brush just because the medium is a bit different. Another set of paints that I'm not using, or rather never grew fond of using, and all of this is really representative of any other artist acrylic set out there, is the artist range of Scale 75. And don't get me wrong, this is a gorgeous set, high density of pigments. They are what we generally call a heavy body paint because of their consistency out of the tube. And there are some painters that produce absolute masterpieces with these paints, but the catch is they're just so different from what I'm usually using. And I'll be honest, this way of painting just isn't fun for me. Even though the colors are gorgeous, the way you can mix them is very unique. But after using them for a while, I just decided the learning curve and increased enjoyment of the process wasn't worth it for me. And just like the Scale 75 paints, I got the Reaper paints because they were promising matte results. But the more I used them, the more I realized I have to fight the paint a lot. They do not thin properly, and when I have them on the brush, they feel like they are drying in really fast. They give a really dusty feeling, and when you put the brush on the miniature, it almost feels like the paint doesn't want to come off of the brush, like it sticks to the brush. So they were a solution for one of my problems, namely that I was fed up with satin results. But in the process of fixing one thing, I created another problem, and these paints just ended up not being the solution that I wanted. Last but not least, I'm not using any of the Vallejo model colors anymore. Okay, that's a lie. They used to be a staple in my painting in the 2000s and in the 2010s, but they were just left behind by all these new paint ranges that took feedback by other painters or were developed by painters for painters. And the takeaway message here is that there is no objectively best paint. Your choice will always be grounded in your own preferences and the task at hand. Some people absolutely love to scale artist acrylics and maybe even just use the primary colors to mix all other colors they need, while others prefer the simplicity of premixed tones. Some people swear by oil colors and the fact they have long working time, and some people absolutely love the gel medium that Scale 75 has. Some like the opacity you can get with Chimera colors. Some enjoy the old Army Painter range because the lower opacity helps with blending. You have to figure out what your goals are, what way of painting you enjoy, which style you like to recreate, and how these paint ranges complement these preferences and proclivities. And now that you know all about colors, it's time to put them to good use by learning some of these painting techniques that everyone is talking about. And if you want to learn them from the ground up, from someone with 20 years of experience, this is exactly the video you should be watching next.